Is it? Okay. Yeah, just briefly on the ASEAN Human Rights Body, they are now in the process of forming the commission. So I think it would be important if we can have the support of the civil society to have at least one indigenous expert be part of the commission. That would be our way in to influence how the commission will address its work. No, another is and this has been already discussed by some of the leaders, is to request or demand an expert, an independent expert, indigenous expert, to look into the issue of indigenous peoples and provide advice to the commission. So that is another way for us to mainstream, no, the indigenous issues within the work of the ASEAN. And later, the long-term perspective that was agreed by the indigenous groups is to demand a working group working group on indigenous issues, no, within the commission, a body under this commission. But at the moment, it's difficult to immediately demand for such because they are allergic in forming any other structure. So the way forward is for the ASEAN to have at least an independent expert to look into indigenous issues and provide advice to the commission. I would just like to respond also to the question raised by Marshall, which is true. I mean, that's in terms of the Asian governments claiming that we are all indigenous or nobody's indigenous. That has always been what they're saying in the international arena, mainly to avoid their responsibility to recognize the collective rights of indigenous peoples, particularly to land rights, self-determination, the implementation of the provisions to FPIC. In fact, I was made aware that the ASEAN governments in Asia came out with like an unwritten agreement that they don't want to see any rights preference in the agreements coming out of the UNFCCC process, which is of course very alarming for us. On the other hand, like Indonesia has and this is again how Asian governments play politics. Now, for example, Indonesia, they would always say they are all indigenous in Indonesia, but in the climate change negotiations, they were actually one of the first government who recognized that the UNDRIP should be part of the framework of the negotiations. See, because of also of the dynamics between the developing countries and the developed countries in the negotiations, the Asian countries are positioning themselves more with the G77 bloc in terms of the conduct of the negotiations, and there's already a recognition that rights should be recognized. So that's actually becoming an entry point for a lot of indigenous peoples to push their government that, okay, can we agree now on rights? Because we have a bigger enemy. Yeah, so what's coming out now is that the international processes is actually helping a lot of indigenous peoples to convince their governments that we can have the same language as long as you recognize our rights as indigenous peoples. And at the national level, there are already legislations recognizing indigenous peoples, not necessarily mentioning indigenous peoples, no? India, for one, which is a huge country, has already accepted Adivasi. And Adivasi has already rights to the forests. So whether or not they admit them as indigenous peoples, it's already happening. At the national level, legislations are already formulated recognizing at least certain rights of indigenous peoples. So the way we are treating is, let's not debate in terms of calling us indigenous peoples, no? You can call us ethnic minorities or Adivasi, Janajati, Orang Asli. Let's not debate on that. But let's agree that even if we are called in those names, our collective rights should be recognized, so that we are not boxed in the debate whether we are indigenous peoples, quote and unquote, using that term or not, but more to how can we exercise the respect and recognition of our collective rights. And that's the way we are trying to proceed with this sort of contentious point in Asia in the claim that we are all indigenous. So I hope that clarifies a bit, Marshall.